Но народ России никому и никогда не сломить.
For over 2 decades, Vladimir Putin built his entire grip on power around one single, unshakable claim: Russia will never be broken and will never run out. Russia sits on more oil than almost any nation on Earth, the third largest oil producer on the planet, a country that turned energy into a weapon, shutting off gas pipelines to entire European nations whenever it served the Kremlin's politics. Putin didn't just sell that story to the world. He sold it to his own people, as proof that no matter what sanctions the West threw at him, no matter how long this war dragged on, Russia would never, ever be the one standing in line, begging for fuel.
I want to stress it once again. The difficulties that are being created on the fuel market are unquestionably temporary and will not affect the general economic dynamics in Russia.
That story of Putin just collapsed, in public, in the most humiliating way imaginable.
Нет бензина, колонки все не работают, просто 60 литров на дизель и на бензин такой же.
Бензин нету.
Бензина вообще нет. Люди стоят в огромных очередях. Это 5-я по счету заправка, на которую мы заехали, чтобы заправить машину.
Isn't it humiliating that in Putin's own capital, under Putin's own government, people are lined up in queues for petrol while Putin's own oil sits untouched underground beneath their feet? But what should genuinely disturb you isn't just the fuel shortage itself, it's what's now happening inside Russia's army because of it. We'll expose the truth later in the video. First, to understand exactly how the man who weaponized energy against the entire world ended up unable to fuel his own citizens, you need to see precisely how far this collapse has already spread, starting with the night Ukraine reached straight into Putin's last untouched safety net and lit it on fire. The footage coming out of Russia right now doesn't look like an energy superpower anymore. It looks like a country quietly falling apart at the pump. In Sevastopol, drivers physically pushed their own cars toward a working fuel station after their engines died waiting in line. In Anapa, a popular Black Sea resort, Cossacks in traditional uniforms were deployed to gas stations, not to guard against sabotage or military threats, but to physically break up fistfights among ordinary vacationers fighting over fuel. In Saratov, officials capped purchases at 30 liters per vehicle. In Novosibirsk, lines began forming in pitch darkness before sunrise and stretched past 24 hours. And then there's Sverdlovsk Oblast, where a gas station held a raffle, the prize, a Lada automobile. According to reporting on the event, the car itself wasn't actually what drew the massive crowd. It was the full tank of gasoline bundled with it. It says everything about what Putin's Russia has become. A single tank of fuel is now valuable enough to draw a stampede inside a nation that ships oil to half the planet, run by a man who has spent his entire presidency insisting Russia would never be brought to its knees by something as basic as gasoline. According to estimates from Novaya Gazeta Europe, by the 2nd of July 2026, this crisis had already spread to at least 78 of Russia's 83 officially recognized regions. 3 regions, Penza Oblast, Irkutsk Oblast, and Zabaikalsky Krai, formally declared states of emergency. Occupied Crimea and Sevastopol had already done the exact same thing weeks earlier, on June 26th. That's nearly the entire country, region after region, quietly admitting the man in the Kremlin can no longer guarantee something as basic as a full tank of gas. Now, here's where this stops looking like scattered misfortune and starts looking like something Putin genuinely cannot control. On the night of July 26th into the 27th, Ukrainian drones struck a facility buried deep inside the Udmurtia Republic, roughly 1,300 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. The site is called Rozreserv Prioritet, formerly known as Gorizont, hidden in a small settlement called Borak. This is not a commercial refinery. This is a closed, armed, government-controlled complex run by Russia's Federal Agency for State Reserves, built specifically to store emergency fuel for the single worst-case scenario a nation can imagine. Total war, total collapse, the day everything else has already failed. In other words, Ukraine didn't just hit another target on a long list, it reached directly into the fuel Putin was hoarding for the day his entire system started coming apart. That day appears to have already arrived. Udmurtia's own governor, Alexander Brekalov, confirmed the strike publicly, calling it the largest mass attack the Republic had faced in recent memory. Workers at a nearby warehouse in Sarapul were evacuated as the attack unfolded. President Zelensky confirmed the operation directly, tying it to what he calls Ukraine's long-range sanctions campaign, a deliberate strategy to drag this war back onto Russian soil and place it squarely on Putin's own doorstep. Here's the detail that turns this from a single strike into something far more damning for the Kremlin. This wasn't even the first time Ukraine reached this exact facility. Drones had already hit this same Gorizont depot once before, back on July 3rd, damaging a fuel storage tank in that first strike. Ukraine came back roughly 3.5 weeks later and hit the identical site again, this time hard enough that regional officials themselves called it the most massive attack the Republic had ever experienced. That is not coincidence. That is not luck. That is Ukraine deliberately returning to a target Putin's own government clearly failed to protect the first time. And that same night wasn't limited to Udmurtia either. Ukrainian drones simultaneously struck a Black Sea export terminal in Rostov-on-Don, killing 2 people and wounding 5 more. A separate strike on Yaroslavl injured another civilian. In Belgorod, 12 people were hurt as fires tore through residential buildings and rows of parked cars. All of this happened in the same handful of hours, while Putin's own military struggled to explain how any of it happened at all. And Putin's own public response tells you exactly how seriously his government is actually taking this. On June 28th, standing in front of cameras at an oil industry meeting, Putin acknowledged the fuel queues directly, admitting, in his own words, that there are unfortunately still lines at gas stations and that the right grade of gasoline isn't always available.
Мы на совещании с членами правительства. Вы хорошо знаете, что проблемы и для автомобилистов, и для бизнеса.
He also called the entire crisis not critical. He said that the very same week, 3 separate Russian regions were declaring official states of emergency over the exact shortage he was publicly dismissing as minor. The queues you just watched aren't the disease, they're only the symptom. Underneath every single one of those gas stations sits a far bigger collapse, one happening inside Russia's own refineries, and the numbers coming out of that collapse are genuinely staggering. According to the Financial Times, Russia produced just 4.1 million barrels of oil products per day in June 2026. That's roughly 28% below the country's own 5-year average, and 35% below what its refineries were actually built to produce. Energy analysts at Energy Aspects went even further, reporting Russian refinery output has now dropped to its lowest level in 21 years, all the way back to 2005. 2 decades of growth, investment, and Putin's own personal branding as an energy titan wiped back to a level Russia hasn't seen since before this war even began. And here's the number that explains exactly why. Ukraine has struck Russian refineries at least 194 times in just the first half of 2026 alone. That's 11 times the pace of strikes from a single year earlier. As of early July, there was only 1 major Russian refinery left untouched anywhere in the entire country, the Angarsk facility in eastern Siberia, sitting roughly 4,450 kilometers from Ukraine. It survives purely because of distance, nothing else. Now here comes the detail that should genuinely stop you cold because it's almost too absurd to be real. Russia, the 3rd largest oil producer on Earth, the country Putin has spent decades branding as an unshakable energy superpower, has been forced to start importing gasoline from India. India has no domestic oil production of its own worth mentioning. What India actually does is buy discounted Russian crude, refine it into finished gasoline, and now sell that same fuel straight back to the country that produced it in the first place. Putin's superpower is literally buying its own oil back. According to reporting on this arrangement, Russia's own parliament has already approved tax subsidies, specifically designed to offset the cost of these Indian gasoline shipments. Alongside that, Russia imported 141,000 metric tons of gasoline from Belarus in just the first 25 days of June, nearly 2.5 times the entire volume it imported the month before. But Belarus previously sent much of that fuel supply to Central Asian nations, meaning Putin is now solving his own domestic crisis by quietly starving the very allies who depend on him. And when even that wasn't enough, Russia's government did something that reveals just how far this has actually fallen. On the 2nd of July 2026, Prime Minister Mishustin signed a decree reintroducing Euro 3-grade fuel onto the domestic market. That's a fuel standard Russia officially abandoned 12 years ago for being outdated and dirty. Farmers using it in modern imported tractors report it actively damages their own machinery over time. Putin's government is now feeding its citizens fuel quality it publicly rejected over a decade ago just to keep engines running at all. Here's why Russia can't simply repair its way out of this collapse either. Before this war, Western companies like UOP in America and ABB in Switzerland supplied the critical parts keeping these refineries running: turbines, catalytic crackers, hydrotreating units. Those companies no longer fill Russian orders at all. According to energy analyst Sergei Kuyun, replacing just one of those damaged units can cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And because the components are built under Western licensing agreements, even a Chinese or Indian replacement copy legally requires a license Russia can no longer obtain. The Moscow oil refinery itself, struck twice in June, will not reopen until 2027 at the absolute earliest. One industry source told Energy Intelligence flatly that conditions inside Russia's refining sector likely won't improve for the next 2 years. But the weapon actually causing all of this destruction is something almost nobody expected, and understanding exactly what it is makes Putin's entire predicament even harder to escape. The machine tearing through Russia's oil empire doesn't look anything like a weapon of war. It's small, it's cheap, and it's humiliating Putin's entire military establishment in real time. It's called the Firepoint FP1, a small, fixed-wing drone built largely from plywood, foam, and basic composite materials, powered by a simple 2-cylinder engine carrying a warhead somewhere between 50 and 120 kilograms. It costs roughly $55,000 to build. It needs no runway. It launches straight off a truck-mounted ramp and can be combat-ready in about 18 minutes. Now compare that number to what Putin's own air defenses cost to fire back. A single S-400 interceptor missile runs somewhere between $1 and $3 million. Even Russia's cheaper Pantsir system interceptors cost up to $300, 000 each. Putin's military is being forced to fire million-dollar missiles at $55,000 drones and losing that math every single time. And when that math doesn't work in Russia's favor, which is often, Russia simply doesn't fire at all, and the drone reaches its target completely untouched. According to Reuters journalists who observed this campaign directly, these drones fly at extremely low altitude, deliberately skimming terrain to exploit blind spots inside Russia's long-range radar network, a network originally designed to catch high-altitude NATO bombers, not small, cheap drones hugging the ground. Some variants use fiber optic cable guidance instead of radio signals, which means there's genuinely nothing left for Russian jamming systems to actually intercept. Here's proof of exactly how helpless Putin's defenses have become. Before the Tyumen refinery strike on July 25th, Russian personnel had physically installed anti-drone netting over the facility's most critical processing units. But that netting simply did not stop the drone at all. The range this weapon now reaches should genuinely alarm Putin's entire command structure. Early in the war, strikes stayed within 500 to 800 kilometers of the border. By 2025, that reach extended to 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers. Then in June, Ukraine struck the massive Omsk refinery, roughly 2,445 kilometers deep, inside Russian territory, Gazprom's largest facility, the single biggest gasoline producer in the entire country. That strike alone completed something remarkable. By early July, every single one of Russia's top 11 gasoline-producing refineries had already been hit at least once that year. Then came Tyumen on July 25th, roughly 2,000 kilometers from Ukraine, the farthest confirmed refinery strike of the entire war at that point. According to Firepoint's own reporting, an upgraded version of this same drone unveiled at the Eurosatory 2026 Arms exhibition now carries a range extending up to 2,700 kilometers, with President Zelensky stating Ukraine can already reach targets beyond 3,000 kilometers. There is currently only one major Russian refinery left standing completely untouched, Angarsk, sitting in eastern Siberia, roughly 4,450 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. It survives purely because of raw distance. Nothing about Russian air defense has actually protected it. And if this drone's range keeps expanding the way it has for the past 2 years, even that last untouched refinery may not stay safe for long. This weapon has already gutted Russia's refineries and humiliated Putin's air defenses. But the part of this story that should genuinely disturb you is what fuel starvation is now doing to Putin's own soldiers on the actual front line in real time.
Соляра, ты чё, гондон? Ты туда соляру где? Какой функций нахуй? Где соляра? Ты чё, пидор, охуел что ли? Ты нашу соляру, сука,
Где Фуцев, блядь? Кто такой, нахуй?
Ты чё, нахуй? Где она сейчас?
Где он такой, блядь? Фуцев,
Ты чё,
нахуй?
сука? Солярку нахуй, пиздец.
According to the independent Russian outlet Verska, which interviewed multiple serving soldiers directly, Russian units that used to receive fuel based on actual operational need are now rationed to a hard cap of just 20 liters per vehicle per day. One soldier quoted in that reporting didn't hold back at all. In his own words, the gasoline situation is completely wrecked, everyone is getting almost nothing, and there is a catastrophic shortage of fuel across his unit. A mobilized soldier separately estimated that overall fuel deliveries to his position had fallen by roughly 30%. Here's the detail that exposes exactly how broken Putin's own supply system has become. Russia's military only allocates fuel to vehicles carrying official military license plates. But according to multiple reports, up to 90% of the actual transport being used at the front consists of privately owned vehicles, trucks, and cars donated by soldiers themselves or by their own families back home. Those vehicles get absolutely nothing from the official military supply chain because Putin's own army never bothered registering most of the transport it actually depends on to fight this war. Picture what that failure actually looks like on the ground. Soldiers in some positions are now walking up to 11 kilometers on foot just to deliver basic water, food, and ammunition because there simply isn't fuel available to drive that same distance. And then there's the image that should genuinely embarrass every general standing behind Putin. A Russian T-72 tank was abandoned in the middle of an active retreat. Not because Ukrainian forces destroyed it, not because of enemy fire at all, but because it physically ran out of fuel and its own crew had to leave it behind. A modern tank, stranded on a battlefield, beaten by an empty fuel tank instead of an enemy shell. Even the equipment keeping soldiers alive behind the front lines is starving. Generators, powering radar systems, communications equipment, and water pumps all run on the exact same rationed diesel. One soldier stationed in the Kursk region said his own unit's monthly generator fuel costs are climbing from roughly 50,000 rubles to 70,000 rubles, a jump of nearly 40% just to keep basic power running in his own position. This crisis isn't staying inside Russia's own borders either. Kyrgyzstan, which imports roughly 90% of its gasoline directly from Russia, was forced to appeal to Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan for emergency fuel supplies in July after Russian exports to the region simply dried up. Belarus, which used to supply fuel across Central Asia, redirected those exact shipments back into Russia instead, leaving its own regional neighbors scrambling. Tajikistan watched its own gasoline prices spike to the highest level the entire region has seen in years. Putin's allies are now learning exactly what his promises are actually worth once his own country runs short. And it's not just Russia's soldiers and neighbors feeling this collapse either. Back home, Russia's own harvest, the food supply feeding the entire nation, is quietly falling apart at the exact same time. As of the 1st of July 2026, only 1.3 to 1.5 million hectares of Russian cropland had actually been harvested, compared to somewhere between 4.2 and 4.6 million hectares at the same point in 2025. That means this year's harvest is running roughly 3 times slower than last year, and the reason is depressingly simple. There isn't enough diesel to run the machines. A single combine harvester burns through roughly 300 liters of diesel in one shift alone. Russia's own government rationing cap sits somewhere between 20 and 200 liters per customer. Do that math honestly, and one machine for one shift requires more fuel than 15 separate individual civilians are legally allowed to purchase combined. Farmers in Rostov Oblast, a region producing roughly 10 million tons of grain every single year, are already warning of crop losses reaching up to 15%. And wheat doesn't wait patiently for Putin's fuel crisis to resolve itself. According to agricultural analyst Andrei Sizov, director of the Sovcon Analytical Center, this year's harvest is turning into an outright nightmare for Russian farmers because ripened wheat only stays harvestable for a window of roughly 7 to 10 days. Miss that window, and the grain simply falls from the stalk onto the ground. If rain arrives during that same period, harvesters can't even enter the fields at all. So picture the full weight of what Putin is actually managing right now, simultaneously. Soldiers rationed to nearly nothing, walking miles on foot, abandoning armored vehicles mid-retreat. Allies across Central Asia left scrambling for fuel Russia used to guarantee. And back home, the nation's own food supply quietly rotting in the fields because there isn't enough diesel left to bring it in. That's not one crisis anymore. That's 3 separate national emergencies landing on Putin's desk at the exact same moment. For 4 years, most ordinary Russians in major cities could treat this entire war as personal allies. Speaking directly to shareholders at Sberbank's own annual meeting, Gref said something no propaganda broadcast could ever walk back. In his own words, he doesn't believe there is a single person in the entire country whose primary concern is anything other than ending this war as quickly as possible. A friend of Putin saying the whole country just wants this over, as something happening somewhere else to somebody else's son, paid for by somebody else's taxes. According to Jade McGlynn, head of the Ukraine and Russia program at King's College London, the fuel queues ended that illusion completely. In her own words, when you're sitting in a petrol line for the better part of a day, this war stops being an abstract story on the evening news. And that shift is already showing up directly in how Russians view Putin himself. According to Levada Center, Russia's most credible independent polling organization, Putin's own approval rating dropped 5 full percentage points in June 2026 alone, falling from 79% down to 74%.
Не партия власти. Они уже довели до ручки. Пенсионерам, грубо говоря, жрать нечего. На фронте творится хрен знает что.
The share of Russians who actively disapprove of his performance climbed from 15% to 21%, the highest level recorded since the September 2022 mobilization crisis. According to Ukrainian intelligence, internal Russian security documents reportedly acknowledge a steady, ongoing decline in public support for the ruling party, warning that dissatisfaction will likely keep growing straight through autumn. The single most damaging statement in this entire crisis didn't come from a politician at all. It came from one of Putin's own closest personal friends. Herman Gref, the CEO of Sberbank, Russia's largest state-controlled bank, has known Putin for decades and is widely described as one of his genuinely close pan-independent polling backs him up completely. Surveys reported by the Moscow Times found that roughly 81% of Russians now favor bringing this war to an immediate end. But an empty gas tank isn't the only thing exposing how badly Putin's war machine is actually struggling right now. Because while Russian civilians wait in line for a single tank of gasoline, Russian commanders have been sending entire columns of armored vehicles straight into open ground, betting sheer numbers could overwhelm Ukrainian defenses in one single push. We covered exactly what happened when Russia tried that gamble, a massive tank column, rolling forward with full confidence, and within hours, 9 tanks and 3 rocket launchers were left burning in the open, one of the most devastating single engagements of this entire war. If you want to understand exactly how a fuel-starved army still throws everything it has left into these assaults and exactly how badly that gamble can backfire, that video is on your screen right now, and it's genuinely one you don't want to miss. This is the Frontline Show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.